The actual beginning, though it's not really the beginning, but the actual flashpoint was, I remember very clearly. I can still see the corner in my house in 20 Northmore Road where it happened. I got an enormous pile of exam papers there, and marking school examinations in the summertime is an enormous, very laborious, and unfortunately also boring. And I remember picking up a paper and actually I nearly gave an extra mark for it, extra 5 marks actually. There was one page on this particular paper was left blank. Glorious. Nothing to read, so I scribbled on it, I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I now wanted to try my hand at writing a really stupendously long narrative and to see whether I had sufficient art, cunning or material to make a really long narrative which would hold the average reader right through.
Hello, I'm Graham McTavish, and I've come here to rural Warwickshire in the heart of England to explore the background to one of the most famous works of literature in the world, The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien's great work has its roots firmly steeped in this landscape. This is where Tolkien grew up, and it is these fields and farms which form the inspiration of the Shire, from which the whole adventure begins. However, by the time the tale has reached the second book of the trilogy, The Two Towers, the peace and tranquility you see around here has been left behind in a journey which is fast descending into nightmare.
To Isengard, the Ents cried in many voices, to Isengard. To Isengard, though Isengard be ringed and barred with doors of stone, though Isengard be strong and hard and cold as stone and bare as bone, we go to war, to hew the stone and break the door. For bowl and bow are burning now, the furnace roars, we go to war. To land of gloom, with tramp of doom, with roll of drum, we come. To Isengard, with doom we come, with doom we come, with doom we come.
The Two Towers opens in the aftermath of the ferocious fight between Boromir and the orcs. Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli come upon the dying Boromir. With his last words, Boromir confesses that he tried to take the ring from Frodo, hoping to use it for the defense of Minas Tirith. He tells Aragorn that the orcs have captured the two hobbits, Merry and Pippin.
Boromir is a very complex mixture of good and bad. He hungers for the ring. He keeps wheedling Frodo. Let me see the ring. Let me just see the ring, please. And then he gets mad at Frodo and he says, "You're stupid. Why should a hobbit have the ring? Men, human beings, men of Gondor, especially of all among men of Gondor, deserve the ring."
Although he's done a lot of wrong, at the end, he dies repentant and confessing even.
Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli consign Boromir's body to the waters of the Anduin and set off to follow the raiding party. The Orc Trail leads Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli on a desperate pursuit on foot, north and west across the fields of Rohan, a punishing journey of over 165 miles. After 2 days of the weary chase, with little hope of gaining on their quarry, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli encounter a party of horse warriors returning from a successful battle against the Orc band. Their leader is Eomer, nephew to King Theoden of Rohan. His people are the Rohirrim.
The Rohirrim are very obviously, in many ways, they are Old English. They speak Old English. They don't speak a dialect of it, they speak Anglo-Saxon, yeah.
All of the words that you can identify as belonging to that tongue as opposed to some other tongue. Beduseld means mead hall in Old English. Theoden in Old English means chieftain, and so on and so on.
Merry and Pippin, in the meantime, have managed to escape their captors and slip away unnoticed into the nearby forest of Fangorn. There they encounter Treebeard, the Ent. An Ent is a tall, slow-speaking, tree-like being. Calling themselves the shepherds of trees, the Ents have tended the dwindling forests of Middle-earth since its earliest ages. Treebeard's forest of Fangorn has been suffering particularly grievous injuries at the hands of Saruman's orcs. With Merry and Pippin on his shoulders, Treebeard leads the Ents on a great march to Isengard. Meanwhile, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli search the site of the orcs' last stand, with little hope of finding the hobbits alive, until they discover hobbit footprints leading into the forest of Fangorn. They follow these, but are stopped before long by a wandering old man in a tattered grey cloak. Suspecting at first that he is Saruman the White, they raise their weapons, but he throws off his cloak, and they recognize Gandalf. The wizard has returned.
Gandalf is much the same as at the end as he was at the beginning, only more powerful, and Gandalf the White, he's gone up, he's been promoted, as it were.
How did Gandalf change? He says his power is enhanced, but how is it enhanced? It only seems to be enhanced in terms of his leadership ability, but certainly not a Christ figure. I mean, that's so easy to find Christ figures everywhere in literature. The landscape is littered with them. I just don't see it.
He leads them to Meduseld, the hall of Theoden, king of Rohan. At the doors of Meduseld, they are greeted with some suspicion by the guard. The country is on a war footing. Theoden addresses the wizard with cold contempt, seconded by Grima Wormtongue, who constantly advises caution and restraint. Gandalf exposes Wormtongue as a spy in the pay of Saruman, and Theoden is awakened. At last he pulls himself together and announces that he will himself ride to the defense of his beleaguered western frontier to confront Saruman. Theoden and Eomer lead the riders to the defense of Helm's Deep, an ancient stronghold on the northern flanks of the White Mountains of Gondor, now surrounded by Saruman's forces. They arrive just in time to confront the first overwhelming waves of Saruman's army in a ferocious, night-long battle. As the sun rises, both sides are surprised by the spectacle of a great forest that appears to have sprung up in the rear of the attackers' lines overnight. These are the Hurons, semi-sentient trees with an implacable hatred of orcs. Treebeard has dispatched them to help the Rohirrim. Saruman's forces, caught between the charge of the Rohirrim and the Hurons, take to flight, and no orc escapes alive. Gandalf then leads a small party to Isengard for a parley with the defiant Saruman. During the negotiations, Wormtongue hurls down a heavy missile from a high window, which misses Gandalf and rolls off unheeded to one side. Pippin rescues the large, round crystal ball. That night, Pippin, overwhelmed by curiosity over the crystal ball, sneaks it away from the sleeping Gandalf. His sudden, anguished cry wakes the camp. The ball is a palantir, one of a number of ancient seeing stones used in past ages to communicate over great distances. Through it, Pippin was confronted by the Dark Lord himself.
Grima is trying to destroy or injure or do something terrible to the people down below by throwing that rock, as he thinks it is, I guess, down at them. And of course, because he does that, they get the seeing stone, and the course of things is altered considerably.
Gandalf announces that he must ride at once to Gondor, taking Pippin with him on Shadowfax. The others proceed to the muster of Rohan. Frodo and Sam, in the meantime, have had to negotiate the cliffs and ravines of the Emyn Muil, an exposed stretch of badlands that separates the east bank of the Great River from the dead marshes that lie near the gates of Mordor. There they are overtaken by Gollum. Frodo compels Gollum to guide them into Mordor.
He leads them because, because he doesn't have a lot of choice, and he is bound to the ring. He cannot escape from the ring. The fact that Frodo has got the ring, that draws him.
Gollum leads them through the dead marshes, where the travellers are troubled by strange marsh lights and the apparitions of long-dead warriors in the water. Once through the marshes, Frodo and Sam approach the Morannon, the black gates of Mordor, so heavily guarded they can see no way of entering. Gollum urges the hobbits to allow him to lead them into Mordor by a more secret way, and he leads them around the black gates into Ithilien, a wooded valley that follows the western slopes of the Mountains of Shadow. In the forests of Ithilien, Frodo and Sam are captured by a party of warriors led by Faramir, brother of the late Boromir, who has been conducting a guerrilla campaign against Sauron's forces. Faramir's soldiers also capture Gollum as he tries to catch fish in a hidden pool near Faramir's refuge, but Frodo pleads for Gollum to be spared and allowed to accompany him as before. Faramir grants Frodo's request and sends the travellers on their way. The two hobbits and Gollum then make their way eastward into the Morgul Vale, as a great roof of cloud issues from Mordor, blotting out the sun and casting the whole land into a perpetual gloomy twilight by day. The secret pass Gollum wishes to use lies near Minas Morgul, a place of decay and lingering horror. They are forced to shelter when the King of the Ringwraiths leads the main body of the forces intended for the siege of Minas Tirith. The Ringwraith almost perceives Frodo in the ring, but, distracted by his more immediate mission, he presses on without discovering them. Gollum then leads the hobbits up a steep and narrow mountain pass, partly natural, partly carved out in staircases, known as Cirith Ungol. At the top, he leads them into a long tunnel where he runs ahead, leaving the hobbits on their own. There they are attacked by a monstrous spider, Shelob, whom Gollum has occasionally served by luring victims into her dwelling.
This is Gollum's little plan to lead them that way, because Shelob might get Frodo, and then when she's eaten him, throw out the ring. He leads them away from the Black Gate. He leads them down through Ithilien. But then he leads them up through Cirith Ungol in a way that would fulfill his own ends.
Frodo is stung and falls. Sam, driven by rage at his friend's injury, attacks Shelob in a fury and drives her off. Going back to Frodo, he finds him lying lifeless, and Sam is forced to choose between abandoning Frodo or the quest. Grief-stricken and uncertain, he takes the ring from Frodo's body and says farewell, intending to carry on to Mount Doom if he can. To his horror, he soon finds that Frodo isn't dead, just stunned by Shelob's sting. Sam determines to rescue Frodo from the party of orcs who are hurrying back with their prisoner, but the gate is closed and barred before Sam can reach it, leaving him utterly alone to ponder his next actions.
The plot of the Fellowship of the Ring was carefully measured by Tolkien, both in terms of dates and distance. After the scattering of the Fellowship in the Fellowship of the Ring, the main characters follow widely diverging paths. The Fellowship is broken on February the 26th. Merry and Pippin are raced north and west by their orc captors for 2.5 days across the east Emnet of Rohan to the edge of the Forest of Fangorn, a distance of 150 miles. Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli follow about a day's march behind them, but do not reach the hobbits. In the world of Middle-earth, the month of February has 30 days. After their meeting with Gandalf on February the 30th, they turn south across the west Emnet of Rohan to reach Edoras, the principal seat of Theoden in his kingdom, on March the 1st. Meanwhile, Merry and Pippin are taken by Treebeard and the Ents 50 miles from Fangorn to attack Saruman's citadel of Isengard, which happens from March the 2nd to March the 4th. The other members of the Fellowship accompany Theoden west from Edoras to Helm's Deep, where they fight a battle on March the 3rd. After the battle, they travel north to Isengard, where they are reunited with Merry and Pippin on March the 4th. After his confrontation with Saruman and Pippin's misadventure with the Palantir, Gandalf and the Hobbit ride east and south for several days along the northern flanks of the White Mountains to Minas Tirith, which they reach on March the 9th, while the others return to Edoras with the Rohirrim for their great muster on March the 7th. Frodo and Sam, of course, take a different path, parting from the rest of the Fellowship at their last resting place above the Falls of Rauros on February the 26th. They cross the Great River and then proceed on foot across the rugged hills of the Emyn Muil for 50 miles, heading northeast. There they are delayed for several days by the rough terrain, their own fatigue, and the need to deal with Gollum, who they met on February the 29th. Gollum eventually leads them east out of the hills and into the Dead Marshes on February the 30th. Crossing these on March the 2nd, they come to the Dagorlad, the poisoned ashen plain before the gates of Mordor. On March the 5th, realizing they cannot pass through the Black Gate without being captured, the hobbits follow Gollum's advice and proceed west and then south into Ithilien for 2 days. After a day and a night with Faramir and his company, Frodo, Sam and Gollum set off south through Ithilien until they reach a crossroads, where the Great South Road meets the road that passes west from Minas Morgul to the bridge over the Great River at Osgiliath, which they reach on March the 9th. They conceal themselves there for the rest of the day and set off at sunset along the road to Minas Morgul. Gollum leads them up a narrow pass in the mountains that ends at the western end of Shelob's tunnel. The other end of the tunnel brings them to the precincts of the tower and citadel of Minas Morgul at dawn on March the 9th. The forest of Fangorn extends east from the southern ranges of the Misty Mountains. The river Entwash emerges from its southern edge to empty itself to the south and east into the Anduin, while the river Limlight flows east from the mountains through the forest's northern reaches. Along with the forest of Mirkwood, Lothlorien, and the Old Forest between the Shire and Rivendell, Fangorn is a remnant of a much larger forest that once covered Middle-earth from the Blue Mountains in the west to the Iron Hills in the east. The southernmost peaks of the Misty Mountains divide to form a valley known as Nan Curanir, the Wizard's Vale. This is where the men of Gondor built the fortress of Isengard. Originally, it was a grassy park surrounded by a great wall with a single gate to the south. In it was the Tower of Orthanc, a lofty structure comprising 4 massive piers of stone that meet to form most of its length and then separate into 4 sharp teeth at the summit. Its name in Elvish means Mount Fang. Saruman populated it with orcs, wolves, and wild men who were to serve his own ambitions. As the Anduin flows south from the Mirkwood and Lothlorien, it passes through great tracts of open land, the Wold to the west, the Brown Lands to the east. As it nears the great falls of Rauros, it enters a deep and sheer-sided ravine before gathering into the waters of Sarn Gebir, a large lake at the summit of the falls. At the entrance to the ravine stand 2 enormous statues, carved from the rock of the cliffs. The 2 figures stand facing north, one on either side of the river, with their left hands held out palm upward in warning, and an axe in their right hands. The colossal crowned figures were carved in the likeness of Isildur and Anarion, the first kings of Gondor, to mark the kingdom's northern frontier. Edoras is the city of the Rohirrim, essentially a hill fort enclosing the great hall of Meduseld and its outbuildings. Edoras, which in the language of Rohan means the courts. Built into the foothills on the northern flanks of the White Mountains, Edoras commanded the approaches to Gondor through the gap of Rohan between the White Mountains to the south and the last of the Misty Mountains to the north. To the west of Edoras stands Helm's Deep, a stronghold named after an early hero of the Rohirrim. It comprises an outwall defending the mouth of a deep and narrow ravine in the northern flanks of the White Mountains. A crenellated battlement further in forms the main line of defense. Behind it is a keep, to serve as the defenders' final refuge. Behind the keep, deep caves have been delved into the ravine's sheer slopes. Between the upland wastes of the Emin Muel and the arid plain of the Dagorlad stretch the dead marshes, a maze of stagnant pools and treacherous paths thick with the stench of decay. Its waters cover part of the battlefield on which the last alliance of men and elves fought and defeated Sauron's forces many centuries before the events narrated in The Lord of the Rings. Strange lights flicker and play beneath the surface, illuminating the faces and forms of dead men, elves, and orcs, all in states of horrible decay. Heneth Anun, the window on the west, is a waterfall in Ithilien that veils the west-facing entrance to the caves used by Faramir and his men as a hidden refuge when they were patrolling Ithilien ahead of its invasion by Sauron's forces. At the setting of the sun or the moon, its curtain of fine mist refracts their light in a dazzling display to anyone looking out from within the cave mouth. The citadel of Minas Morgul and its tower were built in past ages by the men of Gondor at the height of their power to keep watch on Sauron's abandoned realm. Originally named Minas Ithil by the Gondorians, it became known as Minas Morgul after its capture by the king of the Ringwraiths, who made it the seat of his own malign influence. The walls of the citadel are built terrace-wise into the mountain's eastern slopes, with the watchtower rising above them at the crest. As Sam notices at his first sight of the tower and citadel, they were built not to keep enemies out, but to guard the land within and prevent escape. The road from Osgiliath to Minas Morgul crosses the Mountains of Shadow through the Morgul Vale. Before it does, a secret path leads into the mountains by another way that follows both natural clefts and purpose-built stairs, both steep and narrow. They lead to the Tunnel of Shelob. The further end of the tunnel opens on the eastern slopes of the Mountains of Shadow, overlooking the inner plains of Mordor beneath the shadow of the Tower of Minas Morgul. There are a number of different races in the two towers, but the Orc are the most noticeable. Squat, ugly and bestial, Orcs are filled with a deeply ingrained hostility towards all living things, including their own kind and their masters, and they have formed the largest portion of any army mustered by the forces of evil throughout the history of Middle-earth.
Other peoples have the choice. You know, they are moral beings. Orcs aren't. Orcs are just nasty automata. You know, they're nasty. You know, what is an orc? It is nasty. You know, you don't get orcs pondering, you know, should I do something nice today? You know, for breakfast. The few virtues they've got are the sort of very basic military virtues of teamwork, but even then, you know, they're always betraying each other, and you know, they're just they're just baddies.
Orcs first appear in the Fellowship of the Ring, but it is in the Two Towers that we really gain an insight into this hideous race. In Tolkien's mythology, orcs were created and bred first by Morgoth and subsequently by his lieutenant Sauron in a brutal parody of the elves' grace and beauty.
Sauron cannot create a race. He can take a race like the elves, he or his predecessor, can take a race like the elves and twist them and corrupt them, as this happened long ago, of course, in the First Age, and turn them into orcs. He had to take the raw material and do something terrible to it. Similarly, as Treebeard says in Book 3, the trolls, they are corruptions of Ents. They're twisted, ruined Ents, if you will, just as orcs are twisted, ruined elves.
Calling themselves the Shepherds of Trees, Ents are among the oldest living beings in Middle-earth. Tall and immensely strong, different Ents resemble different species of trees. Their speech and thought alike are both slow and profound, yet they can be fierce if roused.
If you are a tree, and you've been around for a couple of 100 years, you're not, all these people dashing around, no, you just sort of take things as they come, and you ponder things.
He'd never written about Ents before in all of that elf mythology that preceded The Lord of the Rings, all of the thinking he'd done about this world of Middle-earth and so on, no Ents. But there they were.
When Tolkien was writing this, he didn't know what was going to happen at the end. And he's got this idea that they should have an encounter with a giant, probably an unfriendly one. And Ent, of course, is an Old English word meaning giant.
At the time of the events narrated in The Lord of the Rings, the Ents have suffered a long, slow, and irrevocable decline. The Ents and their Ent wives have become estranged. The Ents are not immortal, so their numbers have steadily dwindled with no hope of increase. Treebeard predicts that their action against Saruman could in fact prove their last. The Rohirrim, or the Riders of Rohan, are a warrior society. Tolkien patterns the speech and society of the Rohirrim on those of the Anglo-Saxons, whose literature formed one of his academic specialities.
The Anglo-Saxon culture of Beowulf is not portrayed as particularly a society of horsemen, but many of the other aspects of the society of Rohan, of the Rohirrim, is definitely from Tolkien's Anglo-Saxon learning.
In the hangings on the wall in Meduseld, Theoden's Hall, it's all very much. And they're even quoting Old English poetry, where now is the horse and the rider, which is Tolkien adapting an Old English verse, And so, yeah, they're Old English.
By placing the apparent archaism of Rohirrim culture against the far greater antiquity of Gondor and Numenor, Tolkien creates a very effective sense of the vast stretches of past time that lie behind the narrative of The Lord of the Rings.
One of the charges constantly levelled at The Lord of the Rings by its detractors is that its characters lack depth and development. But what such critics are often mistakenly reacting to is the fact that Tolkien does not use the same techniques most 20th century novelists use to signal their characters' psychology or development. To put it simply, Tolkien was not trying to write a 20th century novel.
The thing is that Tolkien is working out of a different tradition than realism in fiction. Somebody called his book a novel once, and he got very upset about that because he thought of a novel as the way Hawthorne describes the novel in the preface to The House of Seven Gables, as an account of ordinary life lived by ordinary people, the kinds of things that Jane Austen might write, for example. He said it is rather a romance. They are well-rounded in their own way.
Deeply steeped in the literature of the Middle Ages, which he both analysed as an academic and loved as a reader, Tolkien almost never allows us to intrude directly on the thoughts and inner deliberations of his characters. Instead, like many of the medieval authors he read and studied, he reveals character in action, in what his characters say and do, in the choices they are compelled by circumstance to make, and in their outward responses to the moral dilemmas they must confront. A good example of Tolkien's methods of characterization at work is the changing relationship between the dwarf, Gimli, and the elf, Legolas, who are sent with the Fellowship when it sets out from Rivendell. The history of relations between elves and dwarves in Middle-earth, as narrated in the Silmarillion, records a succession of misunderstandings, antagonisms, and murderous hostilities which lie heavily on the psyches of Legolas and Gimli. The elf, though unfailingly polite and patient, does little to assuage the dwarf's prickly sense of grievances, both historical and personal. After all, Legolas's father, Thranduil, had once imprisoned Gimli's father, Gloin, in The Hobbit. On several occasions, Gimli and Legolas exchange words that called for the intervention of Gandalf or Aragorn to prevent them breaking out in an open quarrel, especially when the elves of Lorien insist that Gimli, as a dwarf, be blindfolded before he can be led into the secret forest realm of Lothlorien. All this begins to change with the company's sojourn in Lothlorien, where Gimli comes face to face with the elf lady Galadriel.
Galadriel wins Gimli's allegiance, wins Gimli's devotion, if you will, because she treats him so well, treats him like a genuine person. Instead of, remember how Gimli was treated when they first came to Lothlorien. We can't let dwarves in here. Dwarves, good God. They blindfold everybody and all that sort of thing. But Galadriel treats him royally, and he becomes her devoted servant. Thereafter,
He and Legolas form a lifelong friendship, demonstrated in their cheerful orc kill competition during the Battle of Helm's Deep, in Legolas's acceptance of Gimli as a passenger whenever they ride on horseback. Like his friends Frodo, Merry, and Pippin, the hobbit, Sam Gamgee, faces perils and griefs in his adventures that have a profound effect on him. In his speech and attitudes, he is at the outset the least educated and most provincial or rustic of the hobbits, something of a country bumpkin. He embodies the hobbit tendency towards the parochial and the insular to the fullest degree possible. He also possesses the countryman's capacity for sizing up new situations shrewdly within his familiar terms of reference. Once he passes beyond the boundaries of the Shire, however, his judgments prove often comically premature and ill-informed.
Sam is definitely a peasant. And, it is a bit overdone, is that. It is. But Sam, I think, doesn't develop all that much, but he does develop. It's when you see his horizons being broadened.
When he sees in the Mirror of Galadriel that trees are being cut down in the Shire, and Ted Sandyman is up to his tricks and so forth and so on. He wants to turn around and go home. And Galadriel points out to him that his duty is to stay with Frodo. She says, these bad things will not happen unless you turn aside to prevent them. Unless you turn aside to prevent them. That will make them inevitable. In other words, the Shire will be destroyed, indeed, if you go home now. I think it's at that moment, with Galadriel's words, that Sam recognizes that his real job is to be with Frodo.
He learns a great deal from the many other characters he encounters, and the change in his character is starkly dramatized in his final encounter with Gollum on the slopes of Mount Doom, as we see Sam grow in strength to such an extent that he becomes a genuine hero. The most powerful of the 5 wizards sent from the Undying Lands in the west to help the peoples of Middle-earth in their struggle against Sauron, Saruman has made a special study of Sauron's devices and been seduced into emulating them. seeking to coerce where he cannot persuade, and using guile, deception, and violence as elements of policy where it suits his purposes.
He takes the fortress of Isengard, which was once garden, orchard, grass, that sort of thing, turns it into mechanical iron posts, paved roads, forges and mills and things underneath the ground, grinding away and making smokes and furnaces and that sort of thing. He turns it into an industrial site, in other words. And that suggests how little vision he has. He's trying to make it look like Mordor itself.
And this is Saruman being tempted by the very idea of power. And this is, where you get more into your Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader type of thing. Saruman is somebody who decides to choose the dark force, if you like, who decides to go the way of evil.
His fall offers him a further opportunity for redemptive change, but this he refuses. His character dramatizes the plight of a soul festering in its own evil, incapable of receiving freely offered grace. And the petty malice with which he exacts his tawdry revenge on the inhabitants of the Shire, up to the moment of his murder by the aggrieved Wormtongue, is particularly effective. Given the fact that he represents an order of being far higher than that of any other character in The Lord of the Rings, it is remarkable that Gandalf should display any recognizable character at all. Still more that we should see it develop in any way. Although he has supernatural provenance and power, Gandalf is in many ways the most fully human of all Tolkien's characters. By turns, he is grave, playful, irascible, and enigmatic. His responses to other characters and to events run through a wide range of human moods and emotions. He can be tenderly solicitous of humble characters like the hobbits, or show the irritation of a grumpy grandfather. He can speak on equal terms with elf lords such as Elrond or Glorfindel, or chastise at need kings and stewards such as Theoden of Rohan or Denethor of Gondor. He can take unaffected delight in the most trivial matters of Shire gossip, while remaining a formidable master of arcane wisdom. His mere presence lends hope to characters otherwise falling into despair, and the true measure of his mastery of his formidable powers is how sparingly he uses them. The great change he undergoes during the course of The Lord of the Rings is, of course, his death in the mines of Moria, followed by his return to Middle-earth. On the one hand, such a transformation marks him out as a being far beyond the human experience. Yet the keynote of his character after his return is amplification rather than change as such.
He actually came back, I suppose you could almost say he came back as more human, but certainly not a Christ figure. Now, this does not prevent the resemblance, of course, and Tolkien himself said that too. He said, and I'm paraphrasing closely, you may be reminded in Gandalf's fate of the incarnation and death and resurrection of Christ, but it is a far greater thing than I would ever dare write about. He saw to see Gandalf as a Christ figure as basically a form of blasphemy, because Tolkien did not himself intend it to have that resemblance.
Gandalf says, I was sent back. Doesn't say who, by, or where he was, but he was sent back.
He returns greater than he was, but not all that different. His former qualities, his kindness towards the weak, his sense of play, his solemn dignity, his wrath when roused, are all present in the new Gandalf to a heightened degree. Throughout this great work, Tolkien employs the device of forests as places of renewed hope. Anyone familiar with Tolkien's biography will be aware of the great regard he had for trees, for their beauty, and for the slow rhythms of their lives. His letters are peppered with angry denunciations of what he saw as wanton tree felling in the name of progress, to clear the way for the machinery and congestion of modern life.
The trees, they're not there just for timber. Trees have an existence in themselves. Don't ask what purpose is a tree. what's a tree for? A tree is a tree. When people talk about Tolkienian forest, it's, always gloom and doom and so on. And in fact, it isn't. When you've got this, you've got some of these walking trees, these huorns particularly, who, when they're riled, can be quite nasty. And if you get them riled, the trick then is to get them riled in a good cause.
When the Ents attack Isengard, Tolkien describes their demolition of its walls like the action of tree roots over centuries, accelerated to a scale of mere minutes. Since Saruman has turned the open green spaces of Isengard into an industrial age wasteland, the scene suggests a rebuke from the world of nature, directed at all those agencies which have exploited it with scant regard for its living textures.
The way that they are used to tear down Isengard, to tear down this mechanical thing of steel and concrete and glass, and they're doing it by sort of freezing onto it like tree roots, doing the work in a few seconds the tree roots would do. And this is really nature getting its own back on civilization, in a sense, certainly on urban civilization, and certainly on the sort of flash postmodern buildings with glass elevators and so on here.
The idea of the horns, the tree-ish creatures that the Ents tree herd around, coming to Helm's Deep is the way Macbeth should have been done when Birnam Wood came to Dunsinane Hill. He said he was always disappointed that Shakespeare made such a botch of that, sending this forest out. He wanted to send a real forest out for a real battle, so he did.
Then with a crash came a great ringing shout. Ra, ra! The trees quivered and bent as if a gust had struck them. There was another pause, and a marching music began like solemn drums. And above the rolling beats and booms, the swell voices singing high and strong. Taroon, naroon, 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 tahora, kumba, kumba, noon. The Ents were coming. And ever nearer, louder rose their song. Da hura hara lamba noon, da lamba tara munda roon, da munda ram, da runda ram, da munda lamba munda tom.
Images of decay and the mood of melancholy they induce dominate many scenes of the Two Towers. Most dramatic are the scenes of the devastation wrought upon the natural world by the life-denying forces of Sauron and Saruman. Isengard turned into an orc and weapons factory by Saruman, the slag heaps and cesspits of the Dagorlad outside the gates of Mordor. Treebeard's lament for the lost Entwives, or Aragorn's meditation as he and Legolas and Gimli passed the burial mounds of the kings of Rohan. Theoden's despair over his son's death and his country's imminent destruction, while on the one hand an immediate emotional response to current events, also has in it something of the wider sadness at the inevitable passing of all earthly things.
Again, you have to remember that in his young manhood, he went through the Battle of the Somme. He went into the war, came out at the end. Of his 4 best friends, only one was alive at the end of it. And various bits of this filter through, but he was not somebody who was just completely gung-ho about war, as you can imagine.
It's very hard to measure how what you've experienced in your life, like going through World War I, for example, for Tolkien, comes out in a work like The Lord of the Rings, but there's no question that it had some bearing. You can't say that this was about trench warfare or anything like that, but you certainly can say that the horror and death that Tolkien saw in World War I, he writes in the foreword to The Lord of the Rings, he says, by 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead. And that's got to have a profound effect on one's sense of life.
Where you get his experiences coming out much more are things like the Passage of the Dead Marshes, where he says later on that was inspired by the shell holes around the Somme, which filled up with water, but which had the bodies of the dead soldiers in them.
For all the vast military forces Sauron marshals against Gondor and the other free peoples of Middle-earth, his single most potent weapon is the despair he can induce among his enemies, through his reputation, through the deliberate terror tactics of his generals, and through the direct agency of his most intimate lieutenants, the Ringwraiths. The resourcefulness shown by Merry and Pippin during their captivity among Saruman's orcs is the direct result of their plucky resistance to the despair their plight could be expected to induce in them. The fate of Rohan hangs in the balance while Theoden sits immobilized by despair, a state his treacherous counsellor Wormtongue has done his best to foster. And he can take fitting action only once he's thrown off the debilitating pall of despair at Gandalf's prompting. Sam and Frodo, as they journey through the forbidding wasteland of the Emyn Muil and the Dead Marshes, labour against a constant undertow of despair, made worse by the occasional appearance in the skies of the Ringwraiths on their monstrous flying steeds. That they can nerve themselves to carry on may be one of the greatest acts of heroism in the entire story. The single-minded obsession of Sauron and Saruman with extending their power leaves them fatally vulnerable to threats that approach them from unexpected quarters.
One of the theological points of the book, I think, is that evil intent often redounds on the side of good. And that's true over and over again. Satan tempted Eve and Adam because he wanted to destroy mankind. But by doing that, he did not destroy mankind, he redeemed it. You think of example after example of how that works in The Lord of the Rings.
Saruman's lofty disdain and impatience with the slow processes of nature lead him to overlook the fury that overtakes him from out of Fangorn. As Frodo, Sam, and Gollum cower beneath the bridge into the Morgul Vale, the king of the Ringwraiths pauses, sensing the nearness of his master's ring. But his mission to prosecute the war against Gondor, where Sauron expects the possessor of his ring to try his newfound power, draws him on before he can discover the fugitives only feet away. Sauron's fierce desire to regain his ring in order to use it as an instrument of domination blinds him to the possibility that his enemies might actually seek to destroy it.
Sauron cannot imagine that anyone having the ring would not use it, because if he had the ring, he would use it. Far less can he imagine that anyone having the ring would want to destroy it, because that's the last thing, as Gandalf actually says this is the last thing that Sauron would even think of as far as the ring is concerned. So he's incapable of imagining what other people are, what other people's intentions or thoughts are.
One of the recurring literary devices throughout The Lord of the Rings is the inexplicable appearance of help from unexpected quarters. As the company sets out from Rivendell in the Fellowship of the Ring, Elrond advises them that they may well find unlooked-for help along the way. And the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers both repeat this thematic motif. The forests that figure prominently in both books serve as the settings for many such episodes. The help in Lothlorien of the Ents from Fangorn comes as a surprise to all but Gandalf. Merry and Pippin's reception by Treebeard is certainly the last thing either of them could have expected after their ordeal among the orcs. After Frodo and Sam's arduous trek into the woods of Ithilien following Gollum, their chance encounter with Faramir and his party offers unlooked-for refreshment to both body and spirit that neither had expected to find between leaving the company and arriving at Mount Doom. From the Hobbit's perspective in particular, the Two Towers carries on the Fellowship of the Ring's pattern of opening out, as Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, whose lives have previously taken them nowhere outside the Shire itself, encounter a bewildering variety of persons and powers in the wider world beyond. A large part of the sense of wonder common to both books, derives from how Tolkien juxtaposes the Hobbit's narrow domestic perspectives against a far larger world of marvels and horrors whose existence they'd scarcely suspected.
Where hobbits from the Shire come from, the Shire is a sort of never land rural England somewhere between 1750 and 1900. This is partly sort of giving this sort of nice, innocent, cosy, and very definitely cosy background to contrast with all the great and grim and dark deeds that are coming up.
It is difficult to talk about sources for Tolkien's narrative in the technical sense of the word. The story is almost wholly his own invention, though a number of literary and historical precedents have done a little to shape his handling of certain elements.
C.S. Lewis famously said that Tolkien was about as easy to influence as a Bandersnatch. But if you look for it, you can see where he's coming from in a number of ways. The sort of thing that you get in the works that he academically was very much involved with. To mention Beowulf.
In Beowulf, Hrothgar's hall has been reduced to a state of despair which parallels Theoden in The Tale of Two Towers. The overall mood of The Lord of the Rings as a whole, with its melancholy sense of the fragility and mutability of earthly happiness, shares a great deal with the dominant mood of Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is similarly steeped in a mournful sense of mortality and the transience of all that men find good in the world.
Tolkien wrote the best Old English poetry of anybody since the poet of Beowulf himself, just as he wrote the best Elvish poetry there ever was.
Other elements of The Two Towers, the quest motif, the chivalric comradeliness that develops between Aragorn and Theoden's nephew Eomer, the gallantry of Faramir, and Gimli's surprising devotion to Galadriel all owe something to the Middle English romance tradition that was another area of Tolkien's academic expertise.
Tolkien was a literary man, of course, and you certainly see Arthurian romance. That's certainly part of the tradition of kingship and true kingship. So that's like Arthur, pulling the sword out of the stone, that kind of analogy there. So that's definitely an element from Arthurian romance.
Beyond the medieval influences, however, other possibilities appear far more tenuous. In their totalitarian aspirations, Sauron and Saruman bear a more than passing resemblance to Hitler and Mussolini, and the glimpses we get of the society of their orcs snarlingly echoes the brutal psychology of the fascist regimes over which those two dictators presided. Some have even suggested that the ring itself might symbolize the atomic bomb, a weapon of frightening power too potent to be used.
There is a similarity between the ring and the hydrogen bomb in that both were real threats. And it's very interesting to see in the second edition, the preface to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, what Tolkien says about this. And he's there not talking about so much the bomb and such, but he's talking about the Second World War. And a lot of people saying, oh, this is a sort of allegory of the Second World War, and saying, no, it isn't. It isn't at all.
Anything can be an allegory for anything else if you want to work at it. That's the way allegory is. X stands for Y, if you can make it do so in your own mind. But as he pointed out, the book was started in 1936. It was started even before he finished The Hobbit. Much of the material that you might say applies to the Second World War was written then, which even in the case of Great Britain was 3 years before World War II began. What he did say, in effect, was nothing like World War II, because if there had been, let's say, something like the Ring in World War II, somebody would have seized it and used it. Whereas in this war, the object is to destroy the Ring.
As far as his conscious intentions went, he insisted that his story followed its own logic, and he often found himself marveling at how history seemed sometimes to be shadowing his fictions. As a devout Catholic, Tolkien was far more likely to be influenced by the messianic strand in Jewish and Christian tradition when shaping Aragorn's part as a redeeming saviour figure. And we know from his letters that his depiction of Galadriel owes a little to the Marian devotions that were part of his own practice as a Catholic.
Well, the first time you get elves coming on the scene in The Lord of the Rings, they are singing a hymn to Elbereth, who is a sort of almost Virgin Mary character. There's very little explicit, but when you know, there was something again of a Christian ethos in this, because it is one of sacrifice.
So there is a religious feeling in the book, but I do not think it pertains to specific Christian events or doctrines. I don't see redemption in that sense. I don't see Gandalf as a Christ figure, for example, because Tolkien specifically denied that repeatedly.
I think the only time you actually get any actual religious ceremony or anything is the standing silence, when Faramir and his men, sort of the equivalent of grace before meals, where they turn to face the west.
Tolkien's scholarly accomplishments as a critic of medieval English literature was grounded in his training in philology, the linguistic science that looks particularly at how languages change and evolve over time. During his studies as a student at Oxford, he came to know not only Old and Middle English, but also Middle Welsh, Old Irish, Old Norse, and Finnish. His deep study of the history of European languages inspired him to try his hand at creating a language of his own and experimenting with how it might change over time. Having created a language, Tolkien felt compelled to give a cultural and historical setting.
He wrote the book in order to have a place for people to speak Elvish. He said, and I'm very glad that this never happened, he said if he'd had his way, he would have written the book in Elvish, which would have decreased its readership somewhat.
Elvish is actually a family of languages, descended from a common ancestor. The development of different but related Elvish tongues reflects the long and complex history of the elves in Middle-earth. Of the two Elvish languages from which words appear in The Lord of the Rings, the first, Quenya, or High Elvish, is learned tongue, a kind of Elvish Latin, as Tolkien calls it. It preserves the ancient tongue spoken by the elves who passed into the West in the early years of the First Age at the summons of the Valar, and it is not spoken by any character in The Lord of the Rings as a birth tongue. It is a language of ancient wisdom and poetry. Sindarin, or Grey Elvish, is the common speech of the elves encountered by the hobbits on their journeys, a much later variant of Quenya. Both languages are characterized by a predominance of front vowels, I, E, and liquid consonants, L, R, creating a mellifluous and delicate sonic texture.
These are people who love words, who love language. And, this is, again, a cultural thing. This is very much a question of high culture. And it is the care of language, the love of language, the love of words, the love of art, and the love of poetry.
The vast majority of the peoples of Middle-earth at the time in which The Lord of the Rings is set use the common tongue, or Westron, as a universal lingua franca. It is a human language, derived from the speech of the first men to appear in Middle-earth, enriched by many words of Elvish origin, acquired during the long years of Númenórean dominance, when men enjoyed the greatest commerce with elves in the history of their relations. It is the language represented by modern English in Tolkien's text. The Rohirrim speak an extremely archaic form of the common tongue, untouched by the elvish influences that entered the language of Númenor. As a result, their language bears the same relationship to the common tongue that Old English bears to modern English. So Tolkien represents their language as Old English. Theoden is an Old English word meaning ruler. Meduseld, an Old English word meaning mead hall. Eomer and Eowyn are Old English personal names. And Theoden's word for hobbits, Holbitler, is a made-up Old English compound which means hole builder. And had it existed in Old English and survived into modern English, it would have taken a form very like hobbit. The Orcs speak a bastardized version of the common speech, laced with elements of the Black Tongue, the language of Mordor devised by Sauron. Here, Tolkien uses more impressionistic detail, creating a language full of dark back vowels, U, O, and heavily stopped consonants, K, G, T, to create a tongue whose few examples sound both alien and unlovely to English ears.
The Orcs spoke as they would, with no care for anything, and their language was actually more filthy and degraded.
Of the language of the Ents, Tolkien gives no direct examples in his text. The few strange words and phrases used by Treebeard are actually series of Elvish words strung together, Ent fashion. Given the glimpses we get of Entish psychology, it's clear the Ents language is extremely polysyllabic and accumulative. When Treebeard playfully objects to the word hill as the name of such a topographical feature, he notes that the Entish word for the same thing will be a record of its entire history, a linguistic embodiment of the thing itself, rather than a generalization. How such a language might actually work, Tolkien leaves to our imaginations. The Two Towers is a text that can be approached on a number of levels. As a piece of pure narrative art, it is an accomplished performance, in which Tolkien marshals the increasingly divergent and complex threads of his story into a satisfying whole. It is also richly textured, a pastiche of Tolkien's wide learning and storytelling zest, in which he makes use of his linguistic and literary scholarship, as well as the earlier history and mythology of Middle-earth, which he'd been developing and expanding for decades, without either overwhelming the story in hand. Not a modern novel, then, by any standard, but something rich, strange, and for those susceptible to its charms, supremely successful.